The axe bit into frozen earth with a sound like breaking bone. The man worked alone on the hillside above the fjord, chopping through layers of ice-hardened soil and stone. His breath rose in white clouds that disappeared into the gray sky. Below him, 3 figures stood on the beach near their beached longship, watching. One pointed, another laughed. The sound carried up the slope on the wind, harsh and mocking. The man did not pause. He lifted the axe again and brought it down with the same steady rhythm he had maintained since dawn. The watchers remained for another moment, then turned away, still laughing. Their footprints marked the snow like accusations. By the time the sun reached its weak midday height, the man had opened a wound in the hillside deep enough to swallow a standing man. He climbed out slowly, ice clinging to his furs, and looked toward the water. The fjord churned, dark and restless, waves striking the rocks with the patience of something that had been killing since before men walked these shores. The longhouse stood alone on the headland, built from salvaged timber and stone dragged up from the beach. No other dwelling existed within a day's walk. The man had raised it himself 3 winters past, after his ship had broken apart on the rocks during a storm that took 11 men and left only him breathing when the waves finally retreated. The hall was small but solid, with thick walls chinked with moss and clay, a peaked roof heavy with turf, and a central fire pit that he kept burning through the long nights. Inside hung dried fish and seaweed, smoked meat wrapped in cloth, tools he had forged himself from salvaged iron. There were no carvings on the beams, no shields hung on the walls, no weapons beyond what was necessary for survival. He lived without ornament or memory. Each morning he checked his fish traps in the shallows and gathered driftwood from the tide line. Each evening he returned to the hall and ate alone. He did not visit the settlement that had grown 2 fjords south, where other survivors and new arrivals had begun to build something that resembled the old ways. He did not speak their names or ask their business. They called him the Digger, though none knew why he returned again and again to the same hillside. They assumed madness or grief. He allowed them their assumptions. The truth was both simpler and more difficult to explain. He was preparing for something they refused to see coming. The wind changed during the night. It came from the north now, carrying a cold that made the fire struggle and the smoke refuse to rise. The man woke in darkness and sat listening. The wind did not relent. He rose and dressed in his furs, pulling on boots lined with sheepskin, and stepped into the blackness outside. The sky held no stars. The fjord below was invisible, but its voice filled the air, a constant deep roar that spoke of power without limit. He walked to the edge of his excavation and stopped. A figure stood on the opposite side of the pit, tall and motionless, wrapped in heavy sealskins. The man could see no face in the darkness. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not call out. He simply stood and waited. The figure remained still for a long time, then turned and walked away up the hill, disappearing into the wind and snow. The man returned to his hall. He fed the fire and sat watching the flames until dawn came gray and reluctant. When morning arrived, he found offerings arranged on the rim of his excavation, a bundle of dried cod tied with gut string, a small carved piece of walrus ivory shaped like a raven in flight, a section of narwhal tusk polished smooth and marked with simple lines. The man knelt in the snow and studied them without touching. He understood what they meant. The figure from the night before had not been a threat, it had been recognition. 4 weeks earlier, an old woman had appeared at his door during a blizzard. She had not asked for shelter, she had simply stood there, bent against the wind, snow gathering on her shoulders. He had opened the door wider and stepped aside. She entered and sat by his fire without speaking. He had given her hot broth and dried fish. She ate slowly, watching him with eyes that seemed to measure something beyond his actions. When the storm passed at dawn, she rose and left without a word. But she had looked at him before she went, a look that suggested she had found what she came seeking. The offerings confirmed it. She had been testing him, not his strength or his wealth, but his capacity for basic human decency when no one was watching and no reward was expected. The people who left these gifts lived by a code older than the longships and the raids and the halls filled with warriors boasting of their deeds. They valued silence over speech. They valued action over intention. The man stood and left the offerings where they lay. To take them would be to accept a bond he did not yet understand. To destroy them would be to reject something he suspected he might need. So he left them untouched and returned to his work. The settlement sent men on the 5th day, 4 warriors on foot carrying spears and axes, moving in a tight group up the beach. They stopped at the base of the hill and called to him. The man set down his tools and walked to the edge of his excavation. The warriors climbed halfway up the slope. The largest among them, a thick-shouldered man with gray in his beard and scars crossing his face, spoke first. He said the digging was unnatural. He said it disturbed the spirits of the land. He said the old families who lived beyond the ridge sent warnings, claiming the work angered forces that should be left in peace. The man listened without responding. When the scarred warrior finished, the man asked if this land belonged to anyone. The warriors said no. The man asked if he had violated any law or custom. The warrior hesitated, then said no. The man nodded once and returned to his excavation. The warriors stood uncertain, looking at each other. Then they turned and walked back down the hill. But the man knew their uncertainty would not last. Fear always sought something to destroy.
The temperature fell sharply that night. The wind stopped completely. The air became so still and cold it hurt to breathe. The man worked by the light of a seal oil lamp, deepening the excavation and shaping its walls. He had been digging for weeks now, but the purpose would have been unclear to anyone watching. It was not a storage pit. It was not a grave. It was not a dwelling. The shape was wrong for all of those. It curved inward at the top and widened at the base, following measurements he had learned from a ship's builder he once knew, a man who understood how to protect fragile things from overwhelming force. That builder was dead now, drowned in the same storm that had brought the digger to this shore, but his knowledge remained, pressed into the digger's memory through years of watching and listening. The excavation was a refuge designed according to principles the settlement had forgotten in their rush to rebuild what they had lost. The old woman returned on the 8th day. She came in full daylight this time, walking slowly up the hill with her staff, and beside her walked a younger woman who moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted her right to exist exactly as she was. The younger woman was tall and lean, with long dark hair bound in a thick braid that fell past her shoulders. Her face was angular and strong, with high cheekbones and pale eyes that seemed to see through surface things to the structure beneath. She wore heavy furs that hung open despite the cold, revealing a fitted wool tunic that clung to her body, the neckline cut low enough to show the strong lines of her collarbones and the curve of her throat. A wide leather belt cinched her waist. Her legs were wrapped in fitted wool bound with leather straps, and she wore boots that reached her knees. She moved like a warrior, balanced and aware. The old woman stopped at the edge of the excavation and gestured for the man to approach. He climbed out and stood before them, ice in his beard and dirt under his nails. The old woman spoke in the old tongue, words he half understood. She said the water was changing. She said the cold was coming faster than it should. She said the digging showed wisdom. The younger woman translated, her voice low and precise. She did not soften the old woman's words or add interpretation. When the translation finished, the old woman reached into her furs and produced a small leather pouch. She handed it to the man. Inside were seeds, winter rye, hardy and stubborn. He looked at her with a question in his eyes. She pointed to the excavation. He understood. The pit was not just for people. It was for the future. The warriors returned on the 10th day. This time there were 8 of them. They carried torches despite the daylight and moved with the aggressive certainty of men who had been given permission to act. They stopped at the base of the hill and formed a line, blocking the path to the beach. The scarred warrior shouted up to the digger. He said the old families had made threats. He said they blamed the excavation for the unnatural cold. He said if the digging did not stop immediately, the settlement would take action to protect itself. The man set down his axe and walked to the rim of his pit. He looked down at the warriors. Then he looked past them to the fjord. The water had changed. The waves moved differently now, slower and thicker, as if something beneath was hardening. The warriors saw it too. The scarred man cursed and spat into the snow. He turned back to the digger and shouted again, his voice rising. He said the man had brought this on all of them. He said the old families were right. He said the digging had woken something that should have remained sleeping. The man did not argue. He knew argument was useless against fear. He turned and walked back to his work. The warriors did not follow. They stood at the base of the hill, uncertain and angry, until the scarred man gave the order to leave. They walked back toward the settlement, but their departure felt temporary. The man knew they would return with fire and violence. The cold deepened. The stillness became absolute. The man worked faster, knowing time was running out. He dug until his hands bled through his gloves, until his shoulders burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The excavation was now deep enough for its purpose. He began the next phase. He lowered thick timbers salvaged from wrecked ships, bracing them against the walls of the pit. He packed the spaces between with layers of dried seaweed and moss, creating insulation that would trap warmth. He carved channels from the bottom of the pit to the surface, angled to catch sunlight and funnel it downward, while keeping wind out. The design was intricate, the work of someone who understood that survival was not about strength, but about preparation and understanding systems. The younger woman came again, alone this time. She watched him work for a long while without speaking. Then she climbed down into the pit and began to help. She did not ask permission. She did not ask for explanation. She understood that some things were built not because they made sense to others, but because they were necessary. They worked together in silence, their breath mingling in the cold air. The fjord froze on the 13th night. The man woke to silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. He dressed and stepped outside into a world transformed. The water had stopped moving. The waves had locked in place, frozen mid-surge, creating a landscape of ice that stretched from shore to horizon. The surface was jagged and translucent, catching the weak morning light and throwing it back in shards of blue and white. The settlement erupted into chaos. People ran through the paths between halls, shouting, gathering what supplies they could carry, arguing about what to do. Some blamed the old families, some blamed the gods, most blamed the digger on the hill. The warriors assembled before dawn. This time there were 12 of them. They carried torches and rope. They came with the intent to destroy what they could not understand.
The man stood at the edge of his excavation and watched them approach. The scarred warrior led them, his face set in hard lines. He climbed the hill alone while the others waited below. When he reached the top, he stopped an arm's length from the digger. He said this was the final warning: fill the pit and leave, or burn with it. The man looked at him without speaking. He saw fear in the warrior's eyes, not hatred, fear.
They needed someone to blame for the frozen fjord, for the impossible cold, for the sense that the world had shifted into something unrecognizable. The man could give them that. He could walk away and let them destroy his work. It would cost him only time and effort. Or he could stand and defend something they would never understand, risking everything for a principle that had no name. The younger woman appeared at the top of the hill. She stood beside the man, her furs open, her fitted tunic revealing her shape, her braid falling over one shoulder. She said nothing. Her presence was her statement. The old woman followed, slower but equally deliberate. She planted her staff in the frozen ground and stared at the warriors below. The scarred warrior looked from the digger to the women, then back to the frozen fjord. His certainty wavered. The man stepped forward. He spoke for the first time, his voice quiet and firm. He said the pit was not a curse. He said it was shelter. He said when the freeze deepened and the settlement's fires burned through all their fuel, when the cold became too much for their thin-walled halls and their dwindling supplies, the pit would still hold warmth. He said they could hate him for building it, they could destroy it, but they could not deny what was coming. The scarred warrior stood frozen, his hands clenching and unclenching around his axe handle. The other warrior shifted uncertainly below. After a long moment, the scarred man turned and walked down the hill. The others followed. The freeze lasted 4 weeks. The settlement lost 9 people to the cold. The digger lost none. He shared the warmth of his excavation with the old woman and the younger woman and 3 children the women brought from beyond the ridge. He rationed his dried fish and smoked meat. He melted ice for water. He kept the seal oil lamps burning low but steady. He did not go to the settlement. He did not offer help to those who had threatened him. When the thaw came, it came suddenly. The ice on the fjord cracked with sounds like thunder, breaking into massive fragments that ground against each other as the water beneath began to move again. The air warmed just enough to make breathing easy. The man climbed out of his refuge and looked toward the settlement. Smoke rose from fewer halls than before. The younger woman stood beside him. She said the old families were leaving. She said they had decided this land was no longer theirs to hold. She said they would go north, deeper into the ice, where the world was simpler and less crowded. She asked if he would come. The man looked at his excavation, then at the fjord, then at her. He said no. She nodded. She had expected this. She reached into her furs and pulled out a small bundle. Inside was the carved raven he had seen weeks before. She placed it in his hand and closed his fingers around it. Then she walked away, following the old woman down the hill and out of his life. The man stood alone on the headland. The wind moved across the snow, carrying the smell of salt and thaw. He looked at the carved raven in his palm, then at the excavation he had built. It had saved lives. It had cost him nothing but isolation and the goodwill of people who would never understand. He did not regret the choice. He walked back to his hall and placed the raven on a shelf beside his stores of dried fish. Then he returned to the hillside and began to fill the excavation. Not because anyone demanded it, but because the work was complete. The earth fell back into place slowly, covering the timbers and the insulation and the careful channels he had carved. By the time the sun touched the horizon, the pit was gone. Only a mound remained, slightly higher than the ground around it, marked by soil that would bloom green in the brief summer. The man cleaned his hands and looked toward the fjord. The water moved again, dark and restless, as if nothing had changed. But something had. He had chosen to prepare instead of ignore. He had chosen to give instead of withhold. And though no one would remember his name or the thing he had built, the choice itself remained, solid as stone, silent as ice, his.